Okay, I think we can begin right now. So is everybody ready? Excellent. Okay, so hello again, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm delighted to say that now is the time for our first of two panel discussions at New Directions 2020. This discussion will run for a total of 75 minutes and is entitled Evidence-Driven Influence, Affecting Change in Educational Policy, and will be moderated by Dr. Jin Yan. Dr. Jin Yan is a professor of linguistics and applied linguistics at the School of Foreign Languages at Shanghai Jiaotong University, China. She has been involved in research and practice of language testing and assessment since the late 1980s and has rich experience in the operation of language assessment programs. Her research interests focus on the development and validation of large-scale and high-stakes language assessments. She is currently chair of the National College English Testing Committee and vice president of the Asian Association for Language Assessment. She is also co-editor-in-chief of the Springer Open Access journal Language Testing in Asia and is on the editorial boards of international and Chinese journals, including Language Testing, International Journal of Computer Assisted Language Learning and Teaching, Classroom Discourse, Foreign Language Testing and Teaching, Foreign Languages in China, Foreign Language World, Foreign Language Education in China, and Contemporary Foreign Language Studies. So as you can see, she's a very busy person. She has and she'll be quite busy here with what is our first panel discussion. So please join me, everyone, in welcoming Dr. Jin Yan and our group of panelists, who Jin will now introduce. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris, for this very long introduction to me. Welcome, everybody, to this panel. I will now share my screen with you. Can you see the screen? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. The focus of our discussion today is on how to bring about changes in educational language policies by using evidence-driven approaches. And this panel brings together speakers who have worked to influence positive and evidence-driven change in educational language policies in a range of contexts. And the panelists today will discuss challenges that they, as professional language educators or assessors, face when trying to get the opportunities to influence policy making in language education. Here are our panelists today: John Simpson from British Council Sub-Saharan Africa, Rukmini Banerjee from Breatham Education Foundation, India, Alison Barrett from British Council East Asia, Isabel Martin from Ateneo de Manila University, the Philippines, Uta from University of Melbourne, Australia. And this is what we are going to do today. Following my very brief introduction, each panelist will present on their views for about 5 minutes, and then we will have a discussion on some of the issues surfaced in the presentations. This will be followed by an open session in which the panel will take questions from the floor. And then I will wrap up today's panel discussion. So this is a reminder: when you listen to our presentations, please think about the questions you would like to ask and send in your questions via the Zoom chat function. Now, here is a brief introduction to what we are going to discuss today. I will talk very briefly about what is the conceptualization of language policy and power of educational language policy. Bernard Spolsky views language policy as comprising of 3 intertwined, interrelated elements. One is language management, that is the formulation of explicit plan or policy, usually written in formal document about language use. Second, language beliefs or ideology, that is what people think should be done. and finally, language practices, what people actually do. So in this definition, there is a multi-layered conceptualization of language policy. David Johnson characterizes this multi-layers in terms of processes. So he used the terms of creation, interpretation, appropriation, which can occur at every level of policy making. Eric Johnson adds instantiation to this cycle of processes. Eric, Eric argues that while the notion of appropriation illustrates the way policies are put into action, put into use, it is equally or more important to call attention to the significance of the way policies are eventually instantiated. So policy has traditionally been conceptualized as a notion separate from that of practice. Spolsky, however, argues that policy and practice need not be seen as distinct. So there is a policy at the level of each of the components he proposed. In other words, policy is conceptualized as practice. And similarly, we can see here terms such as declared policy, perceived language policy, practiced language policy are proposed to refer to the idea that there is a policy within practice. Educational language policy is defined as policies that are created across multiple contexts, across institutional contexts that impact language use in classrooms and schools. Educational language policies, according to Johnson, have historically been used to eradicate, subjugate, and marginalize minority and indigenous languages and their uses, and are therefore instruments of power that influence access to educational and economic resources. The power of educational language policies is exerted by so-called arbiters. In Johnson and Johnson 2015 model, language policy arbiters exert influence on each policy process at each level. It is argued that the nature of language policy arbiter is such that they tend to make the process more hierarchical and structured by exerting their power. So this model contributes to studies of educational language policies by portraying how the interpretation and appropriation of educational language policies is influenced by language policy arbiters. Now today we have 5 panelists who will present on how to influence positive evidence-driven change in a range of contexts, including Sub-Saharan Africa, India, Myanmar, and the Philippines and Australia. First, now let's welcome our first panel speaker, John Simpson. I will stop sharing my screen. And John, it's your turn.
Thank you very much, Yan. I'll just check that everyone can see my screen. So just a couple of little points about context. As Yan was saying, I'm coming from a regional perspective in Sub-Saharan Africa, where language policy is a very hotly contested issue. I'll be focusing on the language policy creation process in my talk. And I'd be interested to see to what degree some of the issues that I present and discussion points resonate with other panelists and also the members of the audience. So I'm looking particularly at the interface of education and politics in Sub-Saharan Africa, insofar as policy formation is often defined as a political decision-making process, or having a political dynamic, or there being political forces operating. So I think it's important for us to look not only in terms of the education sector, but also where it meets the the political economy, if you like. We'll be looking at some of those factors. So I'm going to take a case study, a particular country which
John,
yes,
can you please share your screen? I can't see your screen. Have you shared your screen?
Yeah, sorry, I thought that I had shared my, let me just check again. Sorry, I forgot to click the second button. There we go. Can you now see?
Yes, we can see it now.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry about that. I forgot to click the second button there for screen sharing. Great. Super. So I'll say a little bit about sort of one of the most marked features, if you like, of educational language policy in the region is frequent shifts of policy, fluctuations. I'll be looking a little bit about that, and also trying to see what might account for that, and then go on to say something about our own motivations to influence policy and some challenges met in the process. I'm taking Rwanda as a case study simply because I live and work here, although I could have chosen other countries. It happens to be the context that I know particularly well. As you can see here, over the last 15 or 16 years, there have been 4 or 5 different policies formulated as regards language and education, particularly around the language of learning and teaching. So we're focusing here on the medium of instruction. And you can see that some commentators refer to this as the swing of the policy pendulum. Note that in 2008 to 9, English medium was introduced from P1. Then in 2011, the mother tongue Kinyarwanda was reinstated from P1 to P3. English medium pushed back to P4. And now at the end of last year, English medium has been reinstated as medium instruction from P1. So one might well ask, what accounts for these fluctuations of policy, either in Rwanda or other countries? Is it that decision makers aren't looking at the evidence, which is pretty clear and consistent as regards the relationship between choice of language of learning and learning outcomes? Or actually, or is there more to it? Because one might think it's a little bit of a no-brainer, you know, why wouldn't people look at the evidence and make their policy choices accordingly? And I think we've got very recent examples of that. If I move briefly to the health sector and COVID-19, it's, you know, commentators talk about national leaders who say they are quote unquote following the science, but actually their policies and practices do seem to differ. So I think there are some interesting parallels here between the health sector, policy formation in the health sector, and the education sector. And it's not always evidence-driven as it might be. So looking at this a little bit further, what might account for these fluctuations? I do think it's maybe just a little too simplistic to say that it's because decision makers simply aren't looking at the evidence. And if we move outside the sector and look at the interface with politics and the political economy, and if we accept that there is a political dimension to English language policy, educational language policy creation, because after all, decision makers, ministers of education are often political appointees, etc. We know that in that space, there are lots of different lobby groups, lots of different interests and agendas at work. So what political economy has to say to us is that, amongst other things, education is seen as an economic good. But what kind of good it is and how it's valued is actually seen differently by different groups. So for governments, for instance, education is a system in which they're investing to produce human capital, as it were, to further economic development and poverty reduction goals. I'm looking at it here from a low and middle income country context. Parents, on the other hand, may be more interested in education in terms of it's a service, provision of a service. They're focused on the quality of the offer, and particularly looking to their children. They have huge aspirations for their children, and they want them, obviously, as all parents do, to have a really good life, standard of living. We have private schools and other vested interests, if you like, who, you know, and sorry if this is a little bit reductionist, but it's really, I think, just to make a point. Perhaps they see things slightly differently, an opportunity to to share in the wealth which is within the system and to generate some profits through that particular enterprise. So the argument from political economy then is that major stakeholders in public education hold different sort of notions of which economic good is the highest priority and should be vouchsafed by government policy. Policymakers therefore often adopt inconsistent policies in an attempt to placate the different groups. So here's an alternative explanation, if you like, to our fluctuations of policy. Not simply that policymakers aren't open to evidence or willing to make evidence-based decisions, but rather that we're looking, policy formation operates in this political space where there are competing interests, different priorities, and so on. And so policymakers often then choose different policies at different times to placate different groups. So what motivates us in the British Council and in our work in language education, where we're very fortunate in that we do tend to have good relations with governments, and the door is often open for us to dialogue with ministers and with senior education officials. So we're in quite a privileged position. We do obviously believe in the value and benefits of evidence-based policy reform. It's difficult not to, as a policy practitioner in that sense, since the evidence is so clear and consistent. We're interested in promoting stability and consistency in education, language policy and planning. Here in Rwanda, there's a particularly favorable sociolinguistic context because virtually all Rwandans speak the same language, Kinyarwanda mother tongue. So there isn't that sort of multilingual complexity to deal with in society and in schools. We also have a very favorable educational management context, small country, population 11 million, and very effective lines of communication between district levels. So if you like, the structures are in place, the linguistic environment is favorable, and so you might think it's a good context in which to advocate for evidence-based policy reform. Okay, so what are the challenges that we've met here? Well, as I mentioned earlier, different stakeholders have their own views on language policy. So there's often quite a strong demand from parents for English medium education because of the fact that English is indexed with different things like the modern world, modernity, economic success. It's seen as a gateway to a better life, quote unquote. So there's a symbolic value to English, which parents attribute to the language, which helps to influence their thinking and choice. Vested interests, as I mentioned, the private schools are very keen to, cash in on parents' desire for that, and will actually they will market their educational offer as English medium, both through their literature and through the entrance boards, the signs on the entrance to schools, etc. A huge issue is the lack of political will, I think, for extended use of mother tongue education, which is linked to other concerns. Hi.
Sorry, you are overrun the time. Okay. So super. I think, you may keep some of the following pages to your discussion part.
No, that's fine. This actually is my last slide. Okay. Perhaps I won't say anything further. The audience and panelists can see for themselves.
Thank you.
There are quite a number of challenges there, which suggest that it's more than simply a question of persuading people to follow the evidence, as it were. Thanks, Jan. I'll stop sharing now. Okay.
Thank you very much. Now our next speaker is Rukmini.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to just take you through a few slides just to set the context for the conversation. And let me see if I can share. Do you see the slide?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So what I'm going to do is just talk a little bit about a big source of data that we have in India and just lay out the context. And I'm hoping that in the questions which the panel will have for each other and in the conversations, some of the real issues can come out. The big source of data is our annual Status of Education report. It's called the ASER report. very large. You can see the numbers on the screen. All across the country, go to every district practically. India has more than 600 districts, but we managed to reach about 575. And for a period of about 10 years, from 2005 till 14, this huge survey was done every year. And now we do it every alternate year. And the main focus of the typical big survey is children's ability to read and their ability to do basic arithmetic. Very large samples, more than 500,000 children every year. And all of them, especially the ones above age 5, are given a very simple reading task. And here is the nature of the reading task. We do this in 20 languages. Children can actually choose which language they want to read in. And essentially what we ask is, can you recognize letters? Can you read simple words? Small paragraph, which is at roughly at grade 1 level, and a slightly longer story, which is of the level of difficulty in 2nd grade. So after 2 years of school. Here is a quick glimpse of our last report, which was 2018. Of the last big report, which was 2018. We just released a different one this year, but that's more about what families have been doing during COVID. And here you see that across the country, in grade 5, we have about 50% kids who are reading at least at 2nd grade level, and they could be reading higher. But even after 5 years of schooling, we have a big chunk of children who still are not reading fluently, even in their, whatever language they have chosen to read in. So what is the implication for helping children to read? In 1 year, this is quite some time ago now, almost 10 years ago, we actually went into some depth to ask children about the language of instruction in school and the language that they speak at home. And the assumption when we did this was there are certain parts of India where the home language and the school language are different, but there's large parts of the heartland of India where everybody assumes that you are a Hindi speaker, which is one of our big languages. And therefore, language issues had really not been studied very much there. So we have 22 sort of formal, they are called scheduled languages. And then there are about another 100 which are recognized as languages, but not in this schedule. And what we found out during this survey was that there were 4 types of states in India. And in India, at least the school education is organized by the state government. So each state could have a different policy if we wanted. So we had the 4 states that I've put out here is, there were states where the language, where the government schools largely are in Hindi. We have almost 10 states like that. And then we have states which have a main regional language. Of course, the periphery, and there could be pockets in those states which speak other languages. We have 3 areas in which English is the medium of instruction, although children may be speaking something else at home. And then, of course, there are states in which multiple languages are spoken. Just as an example, in one of our biggest cities, Mumbai, the Mumbai city government runs schools in 8 languages of instruction in the same school system. So, very varied structure. And in addition to all of this, of course, like John was saying, there is a growing aspiration of parents and therefore rising number of private schools, which typically like to say that they are English medium schools. Whether they actually are, how much English they actually do inside the school is a matter of question. And finally, just about 2 months ago, we have a new education policy that has been released, in which the policy says, and I guess, Jin, in your categorization, this would be the language management or the language policy, the declared policy, which says that we should think about a 3-language formula. So that's where India is at. Our reading levels for bulk of the children are quite low. And I think the evidence points to the need actually for much greater evidence in trying to design the language policy. So I'm going to just stop here. I just thought I would set the context for India so we can pick up some of these things later. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Alison. Alison, yeah. You need to unmute first.
Yes, hello,
Good.
sorry. Thank you very much, Jan. I'm just trying to find my slides. Give me 1 second. Okay, hold on. Technical glitch. Yes, here they are, sorry. Can you see them?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great. Thank you very much. So it's really nice to be with everybody here today. I'd like to start by saying I'm not an academic. I'm not an assessment expert or academic, but I have worked as a teacher and a teacher educator for many years. And over the last decade, my role has been in a strategic management role. So my focus today is, from my perspective, what are the strategies, what are the approaches that we can use through the British Council's work that could be applicable for any organisation or individual to try and influence policy change, both at macro level and at the micro level. And I'm just going to give you two brief examples, one from India, where I worked for about 20 years, and one from Myanmar, where I've been working for the last 3 or 4 years. So my first slide is just a high-level overview of the kind of approaches and activities and strategies we used over the last decade or so in India. I think what's really important is that we've been committed to connecting the stakeholders we work with the evidence base, not just for a short cycle of 3 or 4 years, which is a typical planning cycle for the British Council, but actually for the last decade or more. And if you track that right back to around 2013, where we worked with Rukmini and Pratham to do a study looking at the role of home language and English and the impact on reading ability, using the significant database that Asa and Pratham have of 500,000 children across the country. So we've used approaches such as that, so research with partners. We've ensured that the findings from that research are widely available and disseminated and debated and discussed at conferences that we hold for practitioners. So a series of conferences that we've held in India from 2011 to 2016 addressed this issue, particularly the one in 2013 in Hyderabad, which was on language diversity. We've supported the Language and Development Trustees, who hold a conference every other year, of which one of those conferences we hosted in Delhi. We developed, and John himself authored a position paper bringing together our assessment of the evidence and creating opportunities to debate that with policymakers we work with. We also supported Cambridge University to identify and network with a range of partners across India, both universities, institutions, but also foundations and NGOs working in the field of language education. And they recently produced a final research report, again, looking at the role of language of instruction across 3 contexts in India, in Delhi, Patna, and Hyderabad. But at the same time, thinking about the practitioner. So my colleagues in India have also worked with international and national academics in India to produce a practical guidebook for teachers and educators with a range of different activities, resources, materials that can be used in the classroom. So thinking about the classroom implications of policy and policy implementation. And we're quite pleased to see that in the national education policy that this has contributed to the latest focus on a multilingual approach in the national education policy in India. So thinking about the strategic approach and the decisions, I personally find this model very helpful. Actually, this was published in 2011, not 2001. Sorry, there's an error on that slide. But this is just, it's not a language policy model, but it's a policy that might be used more regularly by campaigners or advocacy organizations. But it helps you think through where the different stakeholders are in terms of their views around a particular policy issue. And it helps you think through where your entry point might be to trying to influence and change that policy. So is it that you need to start by thinking about general opinion? Do you need to actually stimulate public debate? Or is it about going straight to the heart of the policy development process and working with the policy arbiters, as Jan talked about at the beginning? Now, this isn't a neat model, and not very many models are, so you wouldn't necessarily start at one end and work your way through systematically as we didn't in India, but I think it just gives you a very useful starting point to help you frame your strategic approach. The case study I talked about at the beginning was about how we've worked to support a more macro approach to change. But I also wanted to give you a brief overview of an example from a more micro context. So in Myanmar, I'm the director of a FCDO funded program, which is a 5-year initiative to support the implementation of a number of teacher education reforms within the pre-service teacher education system across the country. And one of those reforms is the introduction of a new 4-year degree for teacher educator colleges to use with new student teachers. And during the inception phase of that program, we identified that the curriculum materials that had been produced for the teacher educators were quite complex linguistically. And we were concerned that the language levels of the teacher educators and the student teachers that were going to be using those materials would not be sufficient to enable them to really understand both the concepts, but also the content, and to use those materials in the classroom. So we asked our expert colleagues from the British Council's Assessment Research Group to help us think through what we could do to try and generate an understanding of the challenges that those materials might create. So they looked at the materials and they conducted a study of the reading demands that would be required by educators using those materials and compared that with the reading ability of the users of the materials. And we were able to identify there was quite a large gap between the demands and the ability. We presented that to the Ministry of Education and indicated that the risks to learning outcomes that might happen as a result of using the materials. And so the government initiated the translation of those resources into Myanmar to the local language. And now the teacher educators have the opportunity to use either the English versions or the Myanmar versions, depending on which ones they feel are most appropriate for their context. So I think that's just a brief example of how you can think about classroom level policy change or national level policy change and the different approaches to doing that. And these are just some of the lessons that we've learned. And just to pick out one of these, because we'll probably pick up on these in the discussion, but I think from my perspective, it's about bringing in the right expertise from the right people at the right time and not trying to do everything yourself, thinking about your partnerships and how you can leverage that expertise in a way that creates the change that you're seeking to bring about. My final slide just gives you a bit of info about the projects and links. So if anyone wants to look at those in more detail later, they can. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Alison. Now let's welcome Isabel. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Jan. Let me just double click. Oh, can you see my slides? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. I only have one slide. I'm going to talk about the mother tongue-based multilingual education policy of the Philippine government. The nickname for that is MTBMLE, which was introduced to address both the literacy and inclusivity concerns. However, as implemented, it has tended to become a policy that is anti-diversity in practice. The MTBMLE policy was enacted as law in 2013, it's quite new, through the language provision of the Enhanced Basic Education Act. It's very, very new. And it's quite a departure from the previous policy on bilingual education. This MTBMLE policy requires the use of the mother tongue as primary medium of instruction in kindergarten and the first 3 years of elementary schooling. After third grade, the English language and the Filipino language, both official languages of the Philippines, are to be introduced through a transition program from the 4th to the 6th grade until such time that these two languages may be used as primary medium of instruction in secondary education. The primary goal of the policy is to promote literacy. However, it also aims to preserve the Philippine languages, and to do this, 19 Philippine languages out of the more than 175 Philippine languages were identified as mother tongues to be used in basic education. The policy as written is consistent with the principles of multilingual education that promotes the use of the mother tongue in education until such time that this mother tongue becomes a strong foundation for advancing learning in the basic education levels. However, the policy is facing many challenges and criticisms. The first is that English is introduced too early. Although the policy requires the use of the mother tongue as a medium of instruction in kindergarten in the first 3 years of schooling, English and the Filipino languages, the oral fluency, are introduced as early as the 1st grade, prompting protests from educational linguists who warn about the negative effects of early exit from mother tongue education. Second, prevailing language attitudes do not support the policy. Now, attitudes towards languages in the Philippines remain biased against mother tongues. Several attitudinal studies have already shown this, and English remains a prestige language, a language of aspiration for many Filipinos. In fact, among those who protested vigorously against the MTV-ML policy were parents who wanted their children to learn English only. There are reports of students who are punished for speaking their mother tongues in schools. Teachers also insist that students speak only one language at a time, in contrast to actual language used outside the classroom, which is characterized by translingual practice or the fluid switching from one language to another. And finally, these language attitudes also trickle down on testing and assessment practices. And I'm referring specifically to English language tests that persist in measuring language proficiency against native speaker norms, despite the fact that a Philippine variety of English exists. So in the end, we find that although the current language policy in Philippine schools, which is mother tongue-based multilingual education, was a welcome development because of its attempt to address both literacy and inclusivity concerns of basic education. As implemented, it has tended to become a policy that is anti-diversity in practice. That ends my presentation for the Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, our final speaker in this session, let's welcome Ute Nog.
Right, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so in my talk, I want to focus on the role of academic researchers in policy formation. As you probably all know, language testers can take a variety of roles in policy formation and evaluation. They can come in, can be insiders where they take a very active role in forming policy. Very often they also are outsiders where they might critique a policy, often also in retrospect. But the perspective that I want to look at today is the one of invited expertise, where language testers get asked to come in and provide some sort of policy advice aspect of a policy or a whole policy. Now, language testers often don't or are unable to document what happens in such situations. So in this talk, what I want to do today is talk about 2 examples where staff members of the Language Testing Research Centre at the University of Melbourne were asked to provide external policy advice. For each case, I want to comment on how we came to being invited to provide expertise, what advice or expertise we were invited to provide, the complexities we encountered, and whether the advice was taken up. Now, I want to note that none of these examples are actually from educational policy, but I think the examples are nonetheless really interesting and could easily be transferred onto similar situations in educational policy. So the first example comes from the introduction or the proposed introduction of a new citizen bill in Australia. In 2017, the Australian government proposed the introduction of a new citizenship bill, which as part of a range of changes also included the proposed introduction of the requirement of a level 6 on the IELTS test. At the time, we made a submission opposing the introduction of the test to a Senate inquiry that was set up, and were then invited to provide evidence at the Senate hearing. So we positioned ourselves as experts and were subsequently invited to contribute. The expertise we provided focused on the test construct of the IELTS test, the proposed level, the level 6, but also about the language learning trajectories of various populations, including disadvantaged populations, and also possible fairness issues in relation to native-born Australians who we argued might possibly also not reach a level 6 on the IELTS test. The complexities we encountered were that we struggled providing hard data on the language learning trajectories of vulnerable populations at the time in the Senate hearing. While that data might exist, it's very hard to draw on that in a very short time when you're in a situation like that. And then the uptake of the expertise, well, the bill was later voted down, but there were many reasons for this, and it was difficult to ascertain what impact our evidence may have had, although there was evidence of our contribution being in the final report. The other example I want to give today comes from expertise we provided to a professional registration body. Now, this professional registration body is in charge of reviewing the English language of overseas trained professionals and providing them registration to work in Australia. Every couple of years, they review the language standards for professional registration. And we saw that there was a tender advertised, so we applied to that and were chosen as the winner of the tender, and that's how we gained access to that situation. The expertise we provided was varied. All the things had been set out in the tender. They wanted to know information about various tests that they were already accepting, the cut scores. They wanted to know what other regulatory bodies in other similar countries, what tests they were accepting. But they were particularly interested in the equivalence of other pathways they offer to show language proficiency that doesn't involve showing a test score. So applicants can also show their language proficiency by having studied in an English medium university or gone to a school, primary or secondary education. They wanted to know whether these pathways have equivalence to the IELTS. Now note that the IELTS was seen as the thing that needed to be benchmarked against rather than other evidence. Now, the complexity that we encountered was that there was limited research on English language development when studying at English medium universities. And while there's some that exists, there's even less research about language development of students taking online courses. So it was hard to provide evidence on that. In terms of uptake, the regulatory body was very interested in the cut scores and tests used by other similar regulatory bodies, and at times rejected scientific evidence that we could show from standard setting studies, for example. So our expertise in certain areas was rejected. So in my discussion, the road to providing expertise may differ and may be difficult to influence. Even if the expertise is available, there may be no opportunity to providing this. We could have, for example, not been chosen on that tender or not been invited to the Senate hearing. The provision of expertise may be limited by various factors, including insufficient research base being available, research being available, but us not being knowledgeable of it, or it being available, but us not being able to draw on it in the limited time that is available. The academic recommendations may also be rejected because there may be comparisons to other policymakers whose expertise is more valued, and this has been called policy shopping by Birham and Permenter. There are clearly implications for training language testers in what they need to know and how they can engage with policymakers And if I have time, I can just put up one last little slide from Jolo Bianco, who said, as academics, we surrender our expertise to a conversation in which we can shape and influence an outcome, but cannot determine it. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Uta. Thank you all for your wonderful presentations. I think they are all very interesting. The problem is we are running a little bit behind the schedule. So now I'm going to share the screen with the questions we are going to discuss for the panels. So these are the questions panels asked ourselves, and they have prepared some of the answers. So let me share my screen and we can move on to this internal kind of a panel discussion. So the first question is going to be, is addressed to John Simpson. John, would you like to address this question?
Yes.
Hello,
thanks very
John.
much.
Yeah. I'm showing your slide. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks so much. So I think really this picks up from one of the lessons which we've learned in Sub-Saharan Africa, which is that although one can get so far with a kind of a advocating an evidence-based policy creation process, there are many other players involved, stakeholders, vested interests, etc. And so in the quote unquote real world of the political economy, I think there's quite a lot of work to be done out with those conversations held with key decision makers, be they ministers of education or other senior education officials, because we know that there are other lobby groups working, to progress their own interests. And just a very quick comment on the latest change in policy here in 2019. I think it's no coincidence that the minister announced a change of policy, bringing back English medium from primary 1, following a meeting with the private schools organization, who lobbied very strongly for that and put the case that parents don't want Kinyarwanda, they want the mother tongue, etc. So I like the idea of the policy funnel, etc., and the idea that there's a kind of a process, a time-bound process, and it's structured and systematic and organized. But I'd also like to suggest that sometimes policy creation seems to me can be somewhat on the hoof and serendipitous or otherwise, based on the last lobby group that's been spoken to and who has spoken loudest or longest to the to the key decision makers. So I think that's also something to be factored in. So what I'm suggesting here, again, for the community of practice in education language policy formation, how can we actually be more effective? How can we do things better and beyond simply lobbying education officials? I think we need to design well-organized and strategic advocacy campaigns. And I would suggest particularly useful slogan here might be teaching in the right language might be one way in which to focus and to coalesce the campaign for mother tongue-based multilingual education, which is a little bit of a mouthful and not everyone actually understands it. I think also there are opportunities to demonstrate the model of mother tongue-based education to parents and communities, and that's been done successfully in a number of countries in Africa. The challenge here is to scale it up, of course, and to sustain it so that it gets carried forward into policy and practice, as distinct from being a neat pilot, which which has won over parents and communities in a local area. How do we build on that and extend it? I think we also need to better prepare teachers, because I don't necessarily think that teachers at the moment are well trained for dealing with different languages in the classroom, different mother tongues, and also managing, how do you manage a transition from a local language to an international language, be it English, French, Portuguese, in Africa, for example, and how do you effectively deliver the curriculum to learners who have low levels of proficiency in that European language? So teacher preparation, I think, is something to work. Then I think really, certainly in Sub-Saharan Africa, there's a very strong colonial legacy, shall we say, in terms of educational language policy. Isabel's referred to the status and prestige of English. We could say the same of other European languages, this desire to acquire them, etc. So, and that goes, I think, along with somewhat sort of negative attitudes towards extending the use of local languages into the later stages of like upper primary, lower secondary education. So I think along with decolonizing the policy formational process, there's work to be done in elevating the status and use of African, or we might say Indian languages, whichever we're talking about, in informal domains, including education, so that we get much better alignment between language, children's own language, and the learning process to ensure stronger outcomes, academic outcomes. So those are just some ideas, and perhaps colleagues on the panel might have other things to say or to add to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, the next question is about advice from experts is not always taken up by policymakers for a range of reasons. Are there any ways to anticipate what advice may be less likely to succeed? Now, Alison will take up this question. Alison?
Hi, thanks. Yes, just briefly, I think in my experience, and John just touched upon this, it's advice which is just too abstract or academic in nature and isn't easily understood or translated into the real world. So I think it's really important that academics or that colleagues work together to think about how best to frame the evidence so that it's clearly understood and can be situated within a particular context and brought to life. Also advice that isn't easy to implement, particularly around MLE, that's a challenge. So thinking about the implementation strategies and the funding opportunities as well. So I think providing policymakers with a challenge with no solution is never going to work. And then I think the kind of advice that often can be pushed back, and it relates to one of the questions that somebody's just asked from the audience, is what Lizzie Milligan has just framed in her latest study, and she's called it shared reality bias. So for example, if a policymaker has grown up in an English medium environment, has been to an English medium school within a multilingual context, and their English is great, that it's very difficult for them to perhaps understand that the context for somebody else in the same country could be very, very different. So trying to help sort of demonstrate the different contexts that individuals are learning in. Again, so it's all about context, I think, presenting information and evidence within a contextual framework.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, the next question for Ute. Teachers are often directly exposed to educational policies rather than having the opportunity to shape these policies. What can teachers do to create positive change from the ground up? Ute?
Yes, thank you. I actually want to draw for my answer on a paper published by Margaret Dwyer in 2002, who's a teacher educator in New York State who wrote about issues in the New York State educational assessment policy. She quotes in her paper Korn 2001 as saying that damaging educational policies may triumph if good educators keep silent. And she actually makes a call to arms or call to action for teachers in her paper and makes the following suggestions. She suggests that teachers take activist roles within professional organizations, for example, TESOL organizations, as she says that these organizations yield political power. She suggests lobbying on a state or national level for policy changes and in particular targeted funding to address the issue that they're lobbying for. That they demand evidence of test quality from authorities, that demand reporting that shows student growth. So that was specific to that case. And finally, she also challenged teachers to confront the media about inaccurate, sensationalist and shallow reporting of data of certain student groups. She argued that educating journalists is something that groups of teachers can actually achieve. And I'm wondering, and I'm not sure if the audience can respond to this later on, whether this sort of call to action that she puts out in an American context might also translate into other countries as well.
Thank you very much, Uta. Now, the next question is for Rukmini. Given the diverse language backgrounds that children have to deal with in India, how can we understand the implications of such variation on helping children learn how to read? And how do schools and the school systems can prepare children so that learning for all becomes a reality? Now, Rukmini.
So I think in the context of learning for all, before even getting to language, I think there is a lot of other layers that need to be dealt with. So for one thing, do we really want, even in our school systems, by we, I just mean, a broader constituency, do we really believe that all children can learn? And do we really believe that we want to give the opportunity to all children to be able to pick things up? And to a large extent, when I look at textbooks and the way curriculum is organized, I feel actually we are almost constructing our entire system so as to be able to only take those who can cope with the pace at which we have built our system, only they can go ahead. So to me, a very fundamental question is that if we really want all children to be reading in whichever language by, say, 2nd or 3rd grade, then we have to rethink many of the things that we've put in place. So in India, at least, I think one of the problems that we suffer from is a very over-ambitious curriculum starting very early. And whether it is in English or in any other language, the expectations, and I think I completely agree with what Alison said, that a large part of our education pace and our education, what shall I say, building blocks are still things that may have worked for a time or a context in which there was good support for children's learning at home. And so whatever were the difficulties a child faced in school, they could be dealt with at home because there were educated people at home. But the pace of our entire system is kind of built on that, which really is not fair because most children who are in school today don't have that kind of a background and need both more time and more space. And by space, I mean both sort of, conceptual space as well as language space to be able to get onto a ladder. We are saying because everybody here, and I'm sure in the audience as well, has an interest in language. So we just accept that we have a very diverse language background. But I really think that we have to think of ways, whether they are policymakers or advocates, of how we can give a large number of influential people, maybe those people who somebody referred to as the language arbiters, a first-hand experience of what, let's say, a 1st grade classroom in whichever context we're working in is like, and what are the children saying, and what do they understand, and what are they comfortable with? Because the diversity comes in many different ways. And so I think that, evidence is a nice word for saying, how do you capture a lot of experience into nuggets that can then be swallowed by other people? But at some level these days, I'm beginning to feel that the importance of the evidence is in the experience of creating the evidence. And if you don't have that experience of getting to that final point, you almost don't have the ability to digest that final point. So how can we get large number of people to spend time in contexts which are unfamiliar to them, especially, and I think one way to do that is to just go lower down in age and say, what is it like if you are in a 1st grade classroom, nobody understands what you're saying? What is the frustration that the teacher feels? What is the frustration that the child feels? And many of these things, I think, are important before we can design, what works. Reading, it does not come. So one is language, and what is a language of communication to begin with for young children. The second thing is that reading is also something that, at least in India, very large number of families don't do naturally. One of our surveys measured what do you have at home to read. other than a religious book or a textbook. And my firm belief is religious books are meant to be worshipped. They're not really read that much. So they're not a good source of reading material. And textbooks, you get used to it very quickly. So you don't read those either until you're forced to. And so, in helping children how to read, you need to think about what should they have in hand to read, and how do you inculcate that habit or that practice among the family members, because that's where all of this begins, to begin to read. So I haven't answered the questions you gave me at all, because I feel like we have to do a lot of background work to be able to sort of, really get an understanding of the word diverse. What do we mean by the variation? And then, of course, what do you mean by reading? And then we can put it all together to say who should learn to read and how. So I think this needs a much longer conversation. And Alison is nodding because she's been part of many of these conversations with us before. But I think we need to start at brass tacks and start with, do we really want all children to be reading? If so, then there are many different things we need.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rukmini. Now, our next question for Isabel. Could you please comment on the social dimension of testing? For example, test bias and fairness in your country.
Thank you.
Isabel.
Thank you, Jan.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jan, for that. It's a very, very big topic, actually. Usually when we talk about testing and assessment, the tendency is to focus on the psychometric concerns, the content validity. We rarely look at the social dimension of testing. And if I connect this to the MTV MLE policy of the Philippines, as I talked about earlier, the tendency of that policy really is to be anti-diversity, which means that rather than promoting or celebrating all the languages, it tends to look at the language as distinct codes different from each other. When the reality outside the classroom is that because we are multilingual and linguistically diverse, we don't speak in just one language all the time. No, we switch codes. The linguists have said that the default language in the Philippines is a code switch variety, which we can refer to as translanguaging. So if we have that reality outside in the classroom, and then the students are tested in single languages, discrete points, it becomes an issue of fairness in that sense that the students hear something outside, but then they are tested on another thing inside the class. I'll give you one example, and I'd like to focus on English in particular. National tests, standardized tests, continue to test Filipino children on American standards. And clearly there is a Philippine variety of English. In fact, there are Philippine varieties of English. It's not one single variety. And simple things like prepositions, for example, or syntax. If we use American norms, that will be biased against our students who use the Philippine variety. So this is one example. There's lots to talk about actually about test bias and fairness, but I'd like to just focus on that specific example. That has to be made explicit when we talk about policy in the country, but I don't think anybody has even dared to ask about that, when it concerns national standardized exams. So of course, what happens? The students flunk. That's what happens because their proficiency is measured using discrete forms, and the norms used is American English. Okay, so that's all I can say. For there's lots to talk about. I don't want to take up our time.
Thank you, Isabel. Now let's move on to the next question. Many language testers engage with policy as outsiders. How can we become more involved with policy formation? How can we give advice? Alison? Yeah, it's your question. Yeah, again.
Yeah, this is a challenging one, and I think Ut gave some good examples of how you can do that, but also the challenges of this. I think first and foremost, it's important for any education professional in any specific discipline to understand where their discipline fits within a wider context. And with language, thinking about the kind of ideologies and principles that drive policy formation, and having clarity, not just around the sort of academic aspects of language testing in this instance, but the challenges with curriculum, with practitioners, with usage, the varieties of English. So having a very comprehensive picture of the role of the language tester within that wider context. From a practical perspective, I think it's finding where and who the stakeholders are that you need to be working with. So thinking about political economy analysis, as John said at the beginning, trying to identify the visible but also the invisible connections between systems and between individuals in institutions, and how they might operate and where the points of influence might be. What kind of working groups or networks can you join to insert yourself within the debate and the discussion at a very practical level? So in our region, for example, in East Asia, UNESCO have a really active, very proactive working group on multilingual education that we're part of, but that is a forum and a network that enables a whole range of people to join and to share research and evidence and advice. And it's also thinking again about what we were saying earlier about how you can create opportunities so that the evidence you're presenting is credible, and how you can overcome the biases inherent in power structures. So, a policymaker might receive evidence from an individual that they don't respect for some reason, and that lack of respect may be cultural. So having an opportunity to understand the nuances of the context that you're working in, because as an international person, you may not pick up on those cultural nuances. So working with local organizations or individuals and really using the power of both of your experiences and understanding to create opportunities to influence, I think is really important. And then kind of the last piece of advice from me was also thinking about things like the Sustainable Development Goals and the targets and indicators on those, because an entry point to a conversation with a policymaker might be how well a particular context is actually delivering vis-a-vis a particular commitment that a national government has made to an international goal or a target. So I think lots of different ways, but an analysis of the context will be the starting point.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alison. Our last question for this session is for Ute again. What sort of training should language testers receive to be able to position themselves more appropriately with policymakers or in policy discussions? Ute?
Yeah, thanks. I think this is also a question that actually came up on the chat just now. I have thought about this a lot because when I first started working at the Language Testing Research Center, I felt that I didn't have any of these tools available to myself. And I think many of us learn by being thrown into these situations or watching more experienced colleagues. But I think there are really opportunities for us to change the training of language testers. One way to address this might be by offering students some scenario-based teaching where they get exposed to scenarios that are prepared by people who've previously been in a kind of situation like that, and they could be provided with a brief that the policymaker gave, discussing groups how they would respond and what the challenges may be, and then they could hear from the person who was originally working in this policy space, the more experienced language tester, what actually happened and what problems they encountered and so on. So I think another way would be to ask students to maybe interview more experienced language testing practitioners about various scenarios that they've experienced and any challenges they encountered and so on. But I think we're really not doing a good job with training the younger generation in this kind of work at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ute. Now, that's all for this session. I don't think I'm a good manager of time. We are running seriously behind the schedule. And now we are going to open to the floor for questions from the audience. I will hand over to Chris. Chris, could you please ask some of the questions from the audience? Yeah, I will stop sharing my screen.
Okay, thank you very much, Jinyan. I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions, not too much time, but there is a little bit of time for 1 or 2. So let me just read out a question that I saved earlier. This one is for John, actually. So John, this question is from Mirella. Mirella is wondering, based on what you said, that British Council is able to influence language policy in Rwanda. And Mirella wants to know, how do you ensure that your influence is what's beneficial for Rwanda, considering that the British Council, of course, has its own interests and is more likely to promote English in that country?
Thanks, Chris, for that, and thanks, Mirella. So I think the first thing I should say is that I wouldn't actually wish to overstate our ability to influence policy. What I would say is that I think we're able to contribute to the discussion. We have some influence, given our, the work that we do in English, the research that we produce or commission, etc. But we certainly don't determine the outcomes of those discussions. We have the ability to convene and to bring stakeholders together and to create that space for dialogue and discussion. But as you can see from the history of language policy in the country, we clearly, where there's been a series of somewhat inconsistent policy formations, that doesn't in any sense show the influence of a single either stakeholder or advocate or international organization. On the question of our own interests in English and are we likely to promote, aren't we more likely to promote English in that country? I think this is where the distinction between the opportunity, having young learners, young people having the opportunity to acquire the language, to learn English as a subject, and there are opportunities for that within the curriculum, just as there are for other subjects, of course. And we do actually put a lot of emphasis on seeking to strengthen the teaching and learning of English as a subject to provide professional development opportunities for teachers and so on, because we do take the view that the route to English, the least painful route, shall we say, or the most effective route to proficiency in the language is through learning it well as a subject, being able to give. Now, that doesn't necessarily entail using it as the medium of education, because we know that the kind of language that's needed for that, the cognitive and academic language, is very, very demanding. And so we by no means advocate that. And Alison referred to our position paper on medium of education in low and middle income contexts, and the link to that paper, which is freely available and downloadable, was, I think, on her last slide. And so very happy to share that with people. Our position is very closely aligned to the research base, the evidence on the benefits of mother tongue based multilingual education for children, particularly in the early years, but extending that to a point where they have confidence, they have acquired the cognitive and academic language proficiency to sustain their studies before transferring that to English or French or whatever the international language might be. So I hope that may go some way to allay concerns about that. I don't know if Alison perhaps says.
Well, we unfortunately have to bring things to an end, unfortunately, as time is against us. However, I'll leave the chat box open. Our third plenary is starting in 10 minutes, but I think you can, if you want to address 1 or 2 questions that we didn't get the chance to address, then you can do so in the chat box, albeit in rather truncated form. But that, such is the schedule. So thank you so much, everybody. Jinyan, thank you very, very much for moderating and for the wonderful contributions from all the panelists. You're a credit to yourselves, so thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Or. Thank you, Or.
Good to see you, everyone.
Very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Very much.
Okay.